All right, so let's talk a little bit about Esther. You want to just kind of go? How would you say, James? You want to just?
Well, I thought. Well, I mean, this was before, but I thought it'd be good to get a sense of like where we were going. Yeah, but that was while I was setting up, so that we can be talking and be silent. I mean, we can talk about it now. I mean, I do think it's interesting. I just read the first chapters. If you read it slowly, it's kind of it's dramatic for sure.
Yeah, so I think probably the most helpful thing is to kind of think about it as like different. Think about Esther as like in a movie, and different scenes that happen within the movie. I think that's probably the best way to kind of think about it. But in terms of it, just an overall tagline that I think that we all can think about, which I had to kind of just summarize Esther. It's just this idea of how like God is active even when we don't directly see it. So if we think about a tagline, that's probably the one that I'll probably say when God is active. You probably hear me say that all the time, even when we preach it. Even though God is active even when we don't directly see it, right? Mm-hmm. So that overall thing, as you read through it, there's different fingerprints, I would say, that are embedded in the story. So that's why I titled the series "Tracing the Fingerprints of God." Because there's different fingerprints as we look back and say, man, God is not directly mentioned. God is not like directly like incarnate there, but his presence is like, you can't escape that.
You know, I wonder how much backstory does someone need to know when approaching Esther? Because there are a couple elements in there that's like, oh, you probably need to know about, the exile and the significance of what the exile was and et cetera. There's a character in the story whose name, which it's stuff like that. I'm like, I wonder how much backstory they need, and just to draw out some of those lessons. Just when you think about, I mean, I'm always trying to think about takeaways, and when you think what the sermon series is called, "Tracing the Fingerprints of God," and so you would think in every scene you're trying to pull like, hey, what are those? What in this scene can you go see that? That's the kind of thing that God does all the time, which then would correlate to God's probably doing that in your life too. You see what I'm saying? So that way, like by the end of each one of these, or just throughout, I remember when we would write argument papers in seminary, and what they would want in this 30, 40 page paper, 25 page paper, is that it's almost a recurring theme. Like, what's the purpose? Why did he write the book? Why did Paul write the book? And so I think in the same sense, clearly there's, God is always working, his handiwork and that sort of thing. But to kind of keep reiterating what those fingerprints are. Somebody goes, man, I can see your fingerprints all over this place, even though you may not be in the room. Yeah. I can't see you in the room. I can see your fingerprints all over it. So just try to point those out.
I think a major fingerprint as we think about it. So Esther chapter 1 all the way to chapter 2 verse 4. That's one, like, for our purposes, I should say one scene. And then from Esther chapter 2 all the way from 5 to 18, that's, a second scene. Yeah. And then chapter 2:19 through 3 to 15. Yeah. Let's just say there's multiple scenes even in that, but just for our purposes, that's just one scene. But James 19 through to the end of the chapter, I think is a huge fingerprint because, and this gets back to your question, I think when you had said it in the Google Doc about what's discovering the plot idea, whatever. Mordecai, who's Esther's adoptive uncle-ish character, he identifies this plot, this action that was going to take place to kill the king. These two men that was going to go kill the king, and he tells Esther, "Hey, something shady about to go down." That's a huge fingerprint because when we get to chapter 6, remember that the king, he's having insomnia, he can't sleep, and then what does he do? He says, "Yo, bring me out the Chronicle." And tell me a bedtime story.
That's funny.
And then what happens? He the person comes and tells him the story of this thing happened, of how Mordecai saved the king's life. Excuse me, of how Mordecai saved the king's life, So chapter 6 is this big turning point in the entire narrative, but it goes back to this fingerprint.
Interesting.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by like, okay, that's a fingerprint. Yeah, right. Yeah. But and then when you go to the end of the story, how Mordecai is second in rank and blah blah blah, and then Haman. Anyways, it gets very interesting in terms of how we like, oh, God is not directly like God is active even when you don't directly see it.
Yeah. And
that's something that's so easy to like just miss over as you read it.
Right.
So that's what I mean by fingerprints. Anyway, so
what would be some of the I guess like prerequisite reading or just like I guess tips, insight, wisdom? I don't know what to call it. But if somebody's approaching Esther, you can read it as literature. But I'm sure you've read it a number of times, especially preparing for the sermon series. I just wonder, like a few things just right off the jump that are just like, hey, what should people do when they're approaching this book? I mean, all of y'all can answer because all of us read it, but so that they're just more primed to catch some of the things that are good fingerprints. It's like forensic a little bit. You know, you got to go in there and dust a little bit. So I just wonder how people can prepare themselves before, you know, and not, you know, they talk about the exile. That's a really big story. I mean, you can, you know, but are there certain things that you'd say, Ramon, or you, John, or you, Crystal, that I was like, man, I feel like people should do this first because they'll get more out of Esther and then they can contextualize that more to how they're living now, you know?
Nah, I think Crystal, Ramon, you guys can jump in. But one of the things is to have some understanding or knowledge about Persia, because that's the historical context of where they're in. They're in Persia, which is a very massive empire at the time. There's a good book by Edward. I think his name is like Edward or Edwin Yamagachi or something like that.
Interesting. He's Japanese,
I think. But he wrote a book called Persia and the Bible.
Interesting.
And it's very helpful because it gives you, like, if you're going to understand Esther, you got to understand a little bit about the Persian Empire and how powerful they were and all these different kings. And you go from Cyprus to Darius and obviously, you know, Xerxes, that's his Greek name. So understanding about the Persian Empire is helpful in understanding, because that's the context of, that's where they are in exile. And that even gets into the book of Ezra and Nehemiah as well.
That's true. It was the Persians that sent them back. Well, we can get on that later. That I don't want to take it on a tangent, but we can get on that later. Vermont, what would you say?
Well, in a little bit, I mean, I think we need to sort of back up and just say, like, what's the general background of it? We haven't done that. Like, we're just sort of assuming everyone knows what Esther's about.
That's what I was asking.
Well, it's not. Okay. Let's begin with this. I mean, I'd like you. What is the story of Esther for people who've never heard the book of Esther? Like, what, you know, you're taking lead on this sermon series. I'm excited to see you do that.
Because you're gonna be gone. You're leaving me.
I'll be around. I'll be checking you out. I'll be up the front.
Yeah.
Anyway,
you'd be on the live stream.
That's right. But yeah, I mean, you know, let's assume a lot of people have. I know most people have no clue this book is even in the Bible. Maybe the pages of the Bible are sticky in this part. So, what is the story of Esther about? Based on what's your, like, you know, if you're on an elevator, quickly summarize what the story of Esther is about to someone who's there.
All right. So simply put, the story of Esther is about a Jewish orphan female who is in these crazy circumstance that she ends up becoming kind of this idea of chaos to triumph, right? And it's a story about how God demonstrates his care for his people that are living in exile.
Okay. That's good.
I mean, so that's one way to slice it.
All right. So I'm gonna pretend I'm that person talking to you.
Yeah.
So his people, like, what people are we talking about? Why are they in exile?
Yeah.
Like, why is all that important? I mean, I think you said this before, James. I mean, you're right. I mean, I think sort of the background of this is really key. Like, what's actually going on that puts her in this situation?
Yeah. Well, I mean, God's people, being the Jewish people, that's what we at least in in the scriptures and the Bible. That's God's chosen people. They're in exile because ultimately they're sin. They've disobeyed God. They've done a lot of terrible things. They have this relationship with God, but their relationship is kind of severed to some degree because they're not obeying what God had told them to do. So there's powerful empires and different kings that come and puts them in this place of exile, and they're not living in their homeland, and they have to basically adopt and assimilate to the different cultures and customs of that day in order to really survive. But God still has this, even though that his people has been disobedient, he still has their hand upon them to still care for them, even in the midst of them being in trouble. It's kind of like if you think about your parents, back in the day, you could be on punishment or being disciplined or anything like that, maybe even beaten. I know that's kind of crazy nowadays because you can get in trouble for beating your kids.
This is true.
But even with that, like your parents, they if they're a good parent, they still have their love and care upon you, even in the midst of you being disciplined. So it's kind of very similar, I think, in the same way for God's chosen people, that's the case. So yeah,
that's good. So you said a couple of things there that almost I think would be, and there's a lot of good background here. That's what's the more we're talking about this. As it immediately has some questions about okay, so I'd be curious, how far away are they from their homeland, right? So if you I'm looking at a map right now where Palestine is, and I feel like this is like the second wave of exiles. It's just because Syria took out the northern kingdom, so this is sort of they're slowly. I think this is one of the biggest ones that happens, and so they're living in Babylon. At least the map in the back of my Bible. I want to say that's like a Saudi Arabia area, maybe Dubai, somewhere in there. I'd be curious to it'd be good to almost
Iran.
Iran. Okay,
it would be Iran.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's the distance between Palestine and Iran, right? So imagine we're in the United States and we got exiled. How many miles away would that be? Would that be I don't know, Argentina? Would that be,
And this is them telling their own history. So they're saying we were in exile, but if you were to see it on the news, it looked like, so right now in the news, the Taliban are starting to take cities in the Middle East. At least that's what the headline's saying. It'll be as if some hostile nation comes and just snatches them. So it reads as they were exiled, which is hey, God sent them here, and they just kind of walked and was we're in trouble, we got to go sit in the corner. It's but on the news it would have looked like, hey, some nation came and just ransacked everything they had and then took them. Yeah,
took them hundreds of miles away.
Right.
That's crazy. Yep.
So they're in this totally different culture, totally different place. This gets into as I sort of read, so the section, that first sermon, I think is through chapter 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
So chapter 1. So then it's almost it reminds you that we have to kind of situate ourselves in that culture, right? And the Persian culture, the Persian Empire, that's what's dominant. That's what really sticks out to me as I was reading it. This is all about in many ways, the Jewish people are initially they seem like a side character, right, in the story. Mm-hmm. This is about what this king wants to do. Mm-hmm. It's male dominated, right? It's that's what this is, and everyone serves the king. And so it makes you even wonder, is God even in this picture, right? It's the main power source here is the king, right? He does what he wants to do.
He is the God in a sense, in that day and age, he is a God-like figure.
Yeah. And then so the queen doesn't want to show up, you're out, right? And you're out, and we got to make sure to make a lesson of her, so all the men know, don't let your woman do that too.
That's something to tease out. That's a really interesting one to tease out, because that whole
this is the end of chapter 1, right?
Yeah, it kind of seems like that. He seems like a good guy in the beginning. At first it's hey man, there was this king. Yeah. Then he throws his party for everybody from top to bottom. It's hey, and you know what? Give them whatever they want at my expense, on my own dime. Y'all turn up. He was. I'm thinking
but I even think with that though. I'm gonna let you go. I'm gonna let you.
He was flexing for sure.
Say something, Crystal. But I was gonna say I think even with that was the idea of is this. he flexing super
flexing,
hard.
yeah.
Like he's flexing
Way hard.
super hard in a way to show like, yo, this is who I am. This is me. Look at what I have. Look
what
I
can
at all
do.
of this.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's not. I don't know if it's like really this like posture, hospitality, in a healthy way. It's
Agreed.
more like, yo, look at me. Look at this, man. What did it say? I think it said couches of gold and silver,
drinking out of
golden vessels, all this stuff. 180 days. That's like 6 months. They be that's
half a year.
you partying for real. And then after the
6
party
months.
is the after party because we're gonna do it again for 7 more days. You know what I'm saying? So it's just like, yes, he did do that, and maybe for some people he looked like a good guy, but I think it's more so of like this power, like
Well, especially what he asked the queen, right? When he gets to the point of the party, he's like, okay.
because he showed everything he can show.
Yeah.
Now it's like, well, let me show you my trophy case. Let me show you. Let me
Right.
bring my
Trophy
let me bring my queen so y'all
Yeah.
can see this. And it's interesting. I got to do more research on this because some scholars are divided on it. But some scholars actually believe that idea of him telling her to wear her royal crown means only her royal crown.
Oh, interesting.
Meaning, you need to come and show off to my homies your nakedness. And that's like a whole nother thing, which gets into maybe why she might have said, nah, I'm not going to do that. I don't know. Go ahead, Chris. I want to get
whole
you.
other thing.
Yeah.
Yes. No, I was thinking, so I've read like the book of Esther like so many different times, but I've never looked at it. Like I had to look at it in a different lens, especially in the context of where you have the children of Israel, like you guys just mentioned, they're in a foreign land, they're in exile, but then also their beliefs, their customs are so different. And especially when it comes to a king, like I'm looking at Xerxes, right? And I'm like, this dude is really full of himself. He is like so full of himself. You throw a whole party for a whole year, right?
Narcissistic type.
Right. And their law, though, like when you think about the laws as far as a king, you weren't even supposed to take excess silver, gold, anything like that. Like you're expected to, like any foreign king is expected to abuse his power. So I'm looking at him. And then when we're talking about Vashti, like I've always painted her in a poor light.
Really?
I have. Yeah. Like I've always, because
Why you say that?
because we always tend to think that this king is like a godly king, but he's not a godly king. Like, so I'm like, man, the dude is not a godly king. Like you said, you see a lot of misogynistic like tendencies going on. This guy, low key, a little bit narcissistic.
No,
if
high
you will.
key.
No.
High key.
Well, I'm just saying, I don't like using that word.
High key. No,
but
you can
seriously.
say it.
No.
Say it with your chest.
We're going to talk heavy
He's
over here.
flexing,
He
right.
was
we talked
We're
heavy.
going to talk heavy.
We talk heavy
He's
here.
narcissistic.
We talk
He's
heavy in the
misogynist.
preaching collective.
Right.
Come on,
all
man.
the things.
All the things. All the above.
Yes. So I had a real problem with this dude because, like I said, I've seen the movies. We kind of paint him in like this light where he's just like a godly character, but he's not a king chosen by God. So it's like it's okay. Well, it's expected for him to act this way. And so was Vashti actually wrong for standing up for herself in this way? Because if it was today's, like,
What? And today she have a whole movement behind her.
come
She be
on,
like,
now.
what? Me
Yes,
too.
Well, some people would argue that she does have a movement behind her.
she does.
Oh, in this story.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Some people, yeah, for sure. Some people read it that way.
I read it. Well, I've never read it that way.
I
It
think
really did color my lens different.
it's interesting because of the intention they had to try to squelch any kind of movement that could happen. Like imagine it happening now. The first lady talks to a president and is like, "No, I'm not doing that." And then so he's angry, his cabinet says, "Yo, here's what you need to do."
Executive order.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. He said, "Hey, write the executive order, and this is what you need to say. Lock her out,
Right.
right, and then just pick somebody else and make sure they fine." Because that's what he said. Like, if she's attractive enough, then I can make her queen. Which is another. I was like, dang, I could just. And maybe I'm a bit primed because I just finished reading a book by Ellison something Barr. But I read that and I go, dang, I could imagine a sister reading and be like, oh, she's queen just because she's pretty.
Yeah.
Like that was the decision. If she's attractive enough, then I'll make her queen. And I was like, man, that's That's kind of savage.
Well, that just gets into
And they
the
did
next
that
section.
in order for everyone else to be like, hey, this is an example.
Yeah.
Make sure your wives at home treat the husbands the way they're supposed to with honor and whatever.
Well, it centers the man, right? In
Yeah.
all this. And he almost sort of displays that with the kind of, quote unquote beauty pageant, but not really.
We're gonna talk about that. We're gonna talk about that. 'Cause
Right.
I got some thoughts about that.
All right.
Quick note: it wasn't a beauty pageant.
No, it was not.
No.
But yeah, but
We're gonna talk about it. Though.
and that's one of the bad things. I mean, in terms
gosh.
of just how much in church it's portrayed almost that way, and like, well, look, she won, right? Great, congratulations. When in fact, like that's not. That's not all what's going on
Yeah,
here.
again, part 2.
Is that are you doing that in the first? Oh, that's the next. That's the second sermon, right?
There's a second sermon. Cool. Yeah, we're gonna get to that.
All right.
If you notice the movements, go ahead.
I was gonna say, but it still also goes back to, like, even if we look at Vashti in this light where she was unjustly like exiled or just like kind of disregarded, it still goes back to your point. Like, even in the things that you feel like you need to stand up for, God still uses it, because still that had to happen in order for Esther to step on the scene.
Yeah, and then go back to very, very true. And that's why I'm like, the fingerprints of God, even in the midst of all this injustice and stuff, is crazy. So there's a lot of craziness that's going on in the palace. By the way, speaking of palace, I'm a sports fan.
Malice in the Palace?
I just watched the documentary.
Don't spoil it.
The Malice in the Palace.
I'm going to watch it.
You know what I'm talking about? 2004, Indiana
Ron
Pacers,
Artest,
Ron
Meta
Artest.
World Peace.
Oh, yeah.
Goes
Remember the big fight that happened in the palace?
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, think about the palace. Every time I see the word palace, I'm thinking about what happened
takes me
there.
back.
That's a whole other
On
conversation.
our test.
But I just want to say about this, because there is craziness in this palace. A lot of movements that's going on. If you notice the movements of the king, everything is centered around him. He gets what he wants. What I say, go. Very dictator, very authoritative, very all the above that we said. And the moment he can't get what he asked for and wants, then he's like gives his crazy temper tantrum and he's upset and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting, the idea of like, I don't know, I just want to like tease that out a little bit of like, man, like as anybody, forget about king, but anybody as in leadership, if you're always getting what you want, is that really good leadership at all?
And who's actually paying for it?
Right.
Like
That's true.
there should be sometimes, even as a quote unquote leader, whatever position that someone may be, a pastor, a teacher, executive at a company, whatever the case whatever it is, like there should be some times where you like don't get your way. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I know you talked a little bit too, even being on the elder board, Ramon, about like how like how there are times where you felt like you were actually right.
I always think I'm right.
But you were voted against, and you're like, but like that's actually healthy, even if you are quote unquote right?
Sure.
You know what I mean? So I don't know. I just think that's an interesting thing. Like, if you're always, I think maybe that's a good metric to even ask. If you're always getting your way with something, is that right, or is that godly?
Yeah.
I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
I'm interested. I'm really interested in really the cost to others when the king would always get his way. And so it kind of, when he would say he displayed his glory and riches for 180 days, and then after that, tried to throw this big feast and all this thing at the king's expense, it's like, but was it really at his expense, right? Or were other people really paying for that? And so that's on one end to really consider, like, if you are in a position of authority, consider your cost, right? In that aspect. But then I can't help but consider, I do feel like Vashti's reputation is pretty integral. The story is written about the king and the centrality of the king. But the way Vashti is sort of, I think in literary terms, it's like a foil. Like she sort of messes up the whole thing by being like, "No, I'm not going to be your trophy. Or I'm not going to be your, whatever parade. Like you're not going to parade me around like that. Like I'm out, right?" And that was just it. There wasn't and she didn't die.
No.
Right. She didn't.
Right. So even imagine like she was willing, and maybe this is something like, Krista, you could speak to this in regards to like, women's worth or like that kind of conversation, to where she was like, that's fine. Take she lost being a queen, but did she keep her dignity? Right. Is that a question to think through, or to leave people with like what's worth more? Yeah.
Yeah. So when you ask that question initially, like, is it healthy to get what you want? Like, I looked at it in her, like if I was Vashti in that time, because she didn't get what she wanted, like it ended up being really bad for her. And man, like those are the moments where it's like you stand up for what is right. And how do you then, if it were I in that situation where it was, okay, I did what I thought was right and it didn't turn out that way, then how do I center my thoughts? How do I look at this in a way that, okay, how is this going to work out for my good? Because there are some things we feel like we, that it should have turned out this way, but it didn't for her. But yeah, so I don't think it's healthy to get everything you want. That's all I'm saying. Because sometimes you just don't know what God is doing in the end. You don't know what God is working out. And even though, you may have done things intentionally, but
that's really good. One last thing I'll mention as we wrap up here is just, I think how it's interesting to see how just even early on here, the foreshadowing, right, of different things that are important. And so the mention of the fact that you have to come when the king asks you to appear before him, the mention of a decree that can't be repealed, all those things are things that keep a look out for. Those will come back around in the story.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, that's going to conclude our time for the first installment of Preaching Collective, Esther, Tracing the Fingerprints of God. We're out. Love God, love people.